Okay, perfect. Well, hi everyone. Welcome to our World Affairs Council of Kentucky's program with Mr. Don Smith, who will be talking to us today about a book that he wrote, lots of really interesting research that he did on a very special program, a neighborhood in around Berlin. And we thought this was a really interesting tie to a lot of things that's happening right now in the world, if you will, and also kind of a look back in history. We also, as many of you may or may not know, we have a sister city in Germany with Mainz, which is on the other side of Germany, of Berlin, but we thought this would be a really nice opportunity to really learn about the overall context that the country was facing at that time. So. Let me introduce Mr. Smith, Donald Smith is a retired Army Reserve officer. From 1986 to 89, he served in Germany and visited East and West Berlin 3 times. On one of those visits, he saw Steinstueken, my pronunciation, and what is it? Steinstueken, and never forgot it. He has spent more than 30 years working on various tasks in the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army intelligence communities. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Virginia and a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the Joint Military Intelligence College, now the National Intelligence University. He has been published in Military History Magazine, World War II Magazine, Civil War Times Magazine, and the U.S. Army Intelligence Center's Military Intelligence Professional Bulletin. This is his first book, and his family lives in Tucson, Arizona, and is currently a Geographic Information Systems, GIS, instructor for the Army's Military Intelligence School. So, if you will, let's welcome Mr. Donald Smith. Don.
Thank you all, appreciate it. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. First, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about an interesting subject, some history that I think that deserves to be remembered because it is a German-American success story. What we're going to talk about today is the subject of my book, which is a neighborhood in Berlin that found itself in a very unique situation during the Cold War. And it presented some unique challenges and some unique risks, both for the Berliners who lived there and also the Americans, American military and American diplomats that protected them. And when I bring up the next slide, you will see what I mean by a unique situation. And the reason I call it a success story is that the U.S. government was able to keep this neighborhood safe through like 20 years, through the hottest spots of the Cold War. And the people who live there built a very close relationship with Americans that they want to have preserved. And so that's one of the reasons they helped me write this book. And if you are in Elizabethtown tomorrow, if you have the opportunity to go, I'm going to be at the Heartland Book Festival. I'll be giving this presentation again at 9 o'clock. But if you want to come down and how many of y'all have been to the Heartland Book Festival before? If you haven't, I was there today. Today was the day that they brought the kids in. They brought the elementary school, the middle school kids, and it was a glorious mess. Kids running all over the place, teachers trying to keep them under control, authors trying to talk about their books. But it looks like a good community book festival. So if you're looking for something to do tomorrow, I'll be down in Elizabethtown. I'd be glad to see you. All right. So what you're looking at here on the left is a map of the Steinstueken area that I pulled off of Google Maps. Steinstueken is a portion of a neighborhood in Berlin. It's on the southwest corner of Berlin. And for those of y'all that might be familiar with the area, I'm presuming that many of you have had a chance to see some of the more popular German television programs like Generation War, Deutschland 86, Deutschland 89. There's lots of good TV programs that are coming out of German media now. And for those of you that follow those, a lot of them are produced at the Babelsberg Film Studio. That's like Germany's Hollywood, and Steinstueken is right next to that. So this is the outline of the Steinstueken neighborhood. And if you look at this map over here on the right-hand side, this is a map that was produced by the Berlin city government in 1951, right when the Cold War was getting hot. And this hatched line shows the barrier between the city of Berlin and the German state of Brandenburg. And where that comes in important is that, and you'll see it on the next map, this part of Berlin was occupied officially by the U.S. Government and was under U.S. protection. So this officially was American-controlled territory, and everything outside the hatched line was in the Soviet occupation zone, so that was under the control of the Soviet Union and the German Democratic Republic at the time. And if you'll see the outline here of Steinstueken, you can see that same outline here on the map, and you'll notice that there's no connection in between Steinstueken, official connection in between Steinstueken and the city. There is now. There is a road that was created in 1972, but for much of the Cold War, there was no West Berlin controlled road that connected Steinstueken to West Berlin. So what that meant is that the West Berlin police couldn't go out to the village. The U.S. military, if they wanted to go out there, they had to risk a conflict with the Soviets because the Soviets didn't allow them to go out there. But this little neighborhood here was officially part of the American occupation sector. And I'm going to explain why that happened in just a second. The way it happened was an unanticipated consequence of the planning for how Berlin would be managed at the end of World War II. I think a lot of people remember that when World War II ended, the victorious Allies, the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and later France, split up Germany in occupation zones. The Soviets got the eastern portion of Germany, the British got the northwestern portion, and the Americans got the southwestern portion around Munich and Bavaria. Those were all part of the American occupation zone in Germany. And there was a popular joke that came out of that, is that when the Allies split up Germany, the Russians got the food because that was the primary growing area in Germany, the eastern part of the country. The British got the industry because that's where the Ruhr was in the northwest. And the Americans got all the scenery because we were down, that's where the Alps were. I was stationed in Europe, and I think we got the best part of the deal because the American sector was a lot prettier than the others. But then there was an issue with Berlin because Berlin was going to fall inside the Soviet zone, and the British especially were unhappy with that. They thought that because Berlin was such a significant city, there should be, all four of the powers should be in there. So this map that you're looking here on the left-hand side was produced by the Office of Strategic Services, later became the CIA. This is the map that they were using when they went into Berlin in the summer of 1945. We officially moved in to occupy the city in July of 45. And this map was created 4 years later. There's two things that I want to point out here. First, notice how the city is broken down, and it's broken down by boroughs. So when people ask the question, how did Steinstueken end up as an American, part of the American Occupation Center? When the Americans, British, and Soviets in 1944 were starting preliminary planning for how they were going to handle Berlin, you had staff officers from all three countries in London, and they were sitting, okay, what's the best way for us to divide up Berlin? And somebody said, you know, Berlin is broken down into boroughs. Like, for example, New York City is broken down into boroughs. You've got Staten Island, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and each of those have their own local government authorities. And when we get into Berlin, Berlin is broken down into 22 different boroughs. Now, when we get into Berlin, we're presuming the place is going to be a mess because we've been shelling it and bombing it for over a year. And we want to make things that as easy as occupiers, as easy as possible for ourselves. So what we'll do is we will simply divide up the city by boroughs and give each occupying power several boroughs. So we won't just draw lines on a map. We'll say, okay, America, you get these boroughs, France, you get these boroughs, and British, you get these boroughs. And so the Soviets got the eastern boroughs in the city. The Americans got the southwestern boroughs. The French got these boroughs. I'm sorry. That's the British sector there, and that's the French occupation sector. Steinstueken, even though it wasn't officially connected to the city of Berlin, was legally and officially part of the Zehlendorf borough. And Stanley's been to Zeeland, spent some time in Zehlendorf before, and it's right down here. So, by the terms that everybody agreed to, the Americans found that they were responsible for Steinstueken. But when they first moved into Berlin in 1945 and 1946, they didn't really realize that they were responsible for Steinstueken because their hands were full with other things. They were chasing Nazis, they were trying to fix the city after the bombing, and then the Cold War got started. The Berlin blockade and airlift started in 48 and 49. And to demonstrate that, these are US official government maps. This is the map we used when we first went into Berlin, and this is the map that we had at the end of the Berlin airlift in 1949. Steinstueken's right down here. Do you see it on either US government map? All right, I mean, literally we hadn't been thinking about it. That all changed on October 18th, 1951, when the German Democratic Republic, the East German authorities, tried to take over the village. And what they did was they went into town, they posted signs saying, "Congratulations, you've now been absorbed into the state of Brandenburg, the city of Potsdam, and the mayor is going to come see you and tell you about how your life is going to be in the German Democratic Republic." Now, the reason this was important to the United States is this was a direct challenge by the East Germans and the Soviets to American authority. Because this was, everybody knew that this was a place that the Americans were officially responsible for, and essentially we were being tested by the Soviets and the East Germans to see what we were going to do with the village. By the way, the village only had less than 200 people in it. It's only about 31 square acres, about the size of a college football stadium complex. It had nothing of strategic value in it. There was no major power plant or anything. It's what we consider today to be a bedroom community. Okay, so why did we care about that? Well, I think everyone's heard the phrase, it was a canary in a coal mine. In October of 1951, the Cold War had heated up, the Korean War had started. It had been going on for over a year. And West Germans were in a position where they were having to decide how closely they would be willing to align themselves with the United States. Their country had largely started, was well on the path to economic recovery from the end of World War II. Anyone who studied German history at that time period might have heard a term called the Wirtschaftswunder, which is the German word for economic miracle. And in 1949, the Allies implemented in the Western sectors a currency reform. So all of a sudden, German products, German currency became much more valuable, and the German economy took off. And it was really doing well at this time. And the Americans really wanted to harness the power of the German economy because at this point, the Marshall Plan was ending. There'd been huge expenses that we'd had to try to bring Europe along. We now had another war that looked like it was going to last in Korea for a long time. And we were hoping that Europe could start standing up on its feet. And George F. Kennan, who was a famous U.S. Diplomat in the U.S. State Department, talked about how Germany was the economic engine of Europe. And if you wanted Western Europe especially to be healthy economically and pay its own bills, you need to get the Germans up and running. Well, the problem is that the Germans they didn't feel as occupied as they had in 1945. They realized that their country was starting to stand on its own, and they were starting to assert themselves a little bit. So we were not in the point, we were long past the point where we could order the Germans to do something. Now we had to convince them to support us. Now, nobody was really concerned at the time that the West Germans would then sign up with East Germany and become part of the Soviet Union. The Americans were concerned about that. Instead, they were concerned that the Germans might take an intermediate neutral path and not align with anybody. And so if you read history from the time period, you might have heard of something called the Ohne mich movement, which is German for without me. And there was a strong pacifist movement that was going on in Europe in Germany at the time, or at least a movement to try to not have Germany align with either one of the parties. And the justification was, one, Germany has suffered through two terrible wars. We don't want to be in another war anytime soon. Secondly, lots of West Germans were concerned if they aligned with the Americans, that would intimidate, or that would antagonize the Soviets. And so one of the things the Soviets were doing at this point is they were putting out propaganda, and I'm paraphrasing here. They said, we understand that that your society is completely different from ours. And so we're not asking you necessarily to join us, not asking Germany to join the Soviet Union, but what we are asking is that you not align yourself with the United States. You not align yourself with this new organization called NATO. Instead, you take a middle path. And if you don't do that, there's a very good chance that East and West Germany will never reunify because we won't allow that. And that had a real strong impact on Germans who wanted to reunify their country. And this is an example. This was this is from a East German propaganda magazine that came out at the particular time. And what the East German artists are showing you here are Germans in the West, Germans in the East, who are trying to reunite their country. There was a phrase, Deutscher steht an einem Tisch, Germans sit at one table. We need to get the Westerners out of here. And they were portraying the Westerners, and here you see Konrad Adenauer, here you see, of course, Adolf Hitler. They always threw him in there and implied that Hitler was a member of the US military. And the typical prototype American soldier blocking reunification. So the reason Steinstueken was a canary in the coal mine was that, I mean, as the old phrase goes, you don't really care so much about the canary, but the canary falls over and dies in the coal mine. That's an indication that there might be problems elsewhere. So people were treating Steinstueken as a canary in the coal mine. And this gentleman here, does anyone recognize this gentleman here? Ernst Reuter. He was the mayor of West Berlin during the Berlin Brigade. And in October 1951, he was a hero in the West. He was the one who would, at least when you watch the newsreels, it seemed like he was the one that was rallying the West Berliners to stay tough during the Berlin blockade. And so this man was literally a titanic hero at that point. And he got on the side of Steinstueken. And he came out publicly and said, this is a test for the Americans. So when you say you're going to protect every part of West Berlin, which you've been promising to do over and over again, that's part of West Berlin, what are you going to do? And that all fell on the shoulders of this gentleman here. This is Major General Lemuel Matthewson. He was the U.S. Commandant in Berlin at the time. Now, going back through the records, there's no indication that the Americans were actually ready to fight for Steinstueken. I've read the documents that are available, and the discussions that are going on, they talked about political retaliation if the East Germans wouldn't give the village back, but nothing about military operations. Matter of fact, Reuter even went to General Matthewson asking for a military attack into Steinstueken, and Matthewson said, I'll get back to you on that. Okay. But at the same time, Matthewson, what he could have done is he could have come out and said, look, let's accept facts here. I can't send troops to this village. The West Berlin police can't go to this village. Millions of people in Europe have had to move around over the past few years because of all the changes that happened at the end of World War II. We're talking less than 200 people. We'll put them in trucks and we'll bring them into Berlin and we'll resettle them just like millions of other people. And I think that's what the Soviets were hoping. Matthewson didn't do that. He held firm. Now, I think we have to be honest, he bluffed them. What he did is he made a big public relations deal about it. He went out to the press and told them, we're not backing down on Steinstueken. We expect the Soviets to back off. And they did. Once the Soviets saw that once the Americans were not going to back off on this, we think they had been hoping that the Americans would just go along with it. Once Matthewson decided to hold firm, the Soviets then decided to pull the East Germans out of there. And at that point, that removed all doubt. The United States was officially responsible for a bedroom community that they could not drive to or send the police to. Okay. And so that began a situation, that was in 1951, and that situation continued for over 20 years. Okay, and this picture, by the way, Matthewson was a huge hero in the West Berlin press. This was put out by a cartoonist whose pen name was Oscar. His family graciously allowed me to use this cartoon in the book. He was one of the most popular political cartoonists in Berlin at the time. And when Matthewson got the Soviets to pull back, this showed up in the newspaper. There's Matthewson, the German Jaeger, the hunter. There's Mother Berlin holding on to baby Steinstueken. And actually, technically, this picture is incorrect. That should probably be the symbol of the German Democratic Republic there. But Oscar wasn't fooled. He really knew that the Soviets were behind this, so he put the hammer and sickle there. So Matthewson was a hero, and now America had a responsibility to protect this village. And the way that they did it was they decided not to make a big deal of it. They didn't put American troops, huge numbers of American troops in the village. They didn't try to set up a major base there. They didn't try to force a ground movement there. This is an example of how the Cold War played out on a day-to-day basis at the neighborhood level. You had 200 people in this neighborhood that just basically wanted to be left alone, and the Americans and the Russians got together and said, we're not going to make a big deal about this. America, you don't provoke us, we won't provoke you, and we will leave these people alone. And so what happened was, throughout the 1950s, these people went about their lives, the people in Steinstueken went about their lives the way that they always had. Most of them didn't have cars, so the way that they got into Berlin was to go along this wooden path. They had to go through East German checkpoints, and the East Germans would just wave them through. And it became kind of a quiet normal, because everybody recognized that this was a situation that could get really out of hand if somebody decided to provoke an incident, and nobody did. And that's one of the things that I learned by studying the Cold War, especially along the German border and inside Berlin, is that everybody was armed and ready to fight, but nobody wanted to. So they would look for opportunities to de-escalate, and you see a lot of that here in Steinstueken. Having said that, though, there were times that the East Germans decided to squeeze on the village a little bit. I think we've all heard the phrase attributed to Nikita Khrushchev, anytime I want to make the West howl, I squeeze on Berlin. Well, I think the East German government had the same idea about Steinstueken. And they would do little things like they would change the pass requirements with no notice. Or they would say that people who are delivering coal to the village now have to get a special permit. Oh, and you've got to go into East Berlin to get the permit. Or they would just stop allowing the mailman to come in. The mailman got arrested a few times, to the point that Steinstukeners had to go into Berlin and bring the mail back. Now, any time that there was a problem with the Steinstueken residents had a problem with the East German government, the East German border guards, they had to go to the U.S. government, because the West Berliners didn't have the same kind of authority that they do nowadays with dealing with the people in the state of Brandenburg. So anytime there was a problem, generally the American State Department had to get involved. They would go over and they would talk to the Soviets, and they would work it out. So if you read through the records, you see things like discussions between the Americans and the Soviet occupation authorities on exactly how much mail can be brought into the village, and whether the parish priest can come in or not. Because apparently the parish priest had said some nasty things to the GDR border guards, and they didn't want to let him in. And so this stuff happened all the time. So what you're looking at here on the left-hand side is, this was a crisis that was created by a refrigerator. Steinstueken had one refrigerator at the time, and it had broken. And they were not allowing the West German Berlin electricians to come in and check it out. So the people in Steinstueken had to complain to the Americans. The Americans complained to the Russians. The Russians sent 2 Soviet officers into the village of Steinstueken and verified that, yes, indeed, the refrigerator is broken. And so then, meanwhile, the mayor of Berlin said, this is crazy, I'm going to make a scene of this. So that's him right there, the one, the bald gentleman there with a microphone in front of him. And so he said, I'm the mayor, I'm going to go visit part of my community, this community of Steinstueken, which is officially part of the Zehlendorf neighborhood, which is part of West Berlin. And so these are the West Berlin authorities blocking him from going in there. And so, of course, while they're out there, they had a nice event of it. But stuff like this happened in Steinstueken all the time. But these were annoyances for the most part. And everybody learned how to deal with it because they liked living in Steinstueken. It was a quiet place. If any of you have ever lived in a major metropolitan area, you know it's not quiet. There's always street noise and such. The people who lived in Steinstueken said it was deathly quiet because there were just no construction, no buildings around them. They also said it was a nice place to live because the tax collector couldn't get there, so they got away with a few things they admitted they shouldn't have. All right, that all changed when the Berlin Wall went up August 13th, 1961. In September, 1 month later, the GDR surrounded the Steinstueken complex with barbed wire. Up until then, Steinstuekers had been able to go back and forth and talk to their neighbors. That all ended. So this picture ended up in the press. This is a little boy who used to play. He's in East Germany, and and his friend lived over here, and they used to go back and forth. And so, of course, this went all over the wires and created a real problem for the United States. and because what morale in West Berlin was really starting to fall. And they were especially concerned that this time the Soviets would actually take over Steinstueken. So that became the responsibility of this gentleman here. This is retired General, General Lucius Clay. General Clay became a hero in the United States because he was the military governor of Germany during the Berlin blockade and Berlin airlift, and he became one of the faces of the Berlin airlift operation because he convinced President Truman to provide the resources necessary to keep the city alive. And one of the reasons I point this out is it's next year starts the 75th anniversary of the Berlin airlift, so we'll be talking more about that because that's another success that we need to commemorate. So Clay was a hero in Berlin as a result of that. When the Berlin Wall went up, Clay was retired, but President Kennedy knew that the people in Berlin really trusted him, so he sent him there as his personal representative. So Clay got there, and Clay he didn't think like a diplomat, he thought like a general. And he said, once I get here, I need to take some initiative to show that now that I'm here, America's going to make some things happen. But I need to do it in such a way that the East Germans don't start shooting at us. So I had to be very careful. Fortunately, Clay was very good at that kind of thing. And then he heard about Steinstueken. He said, I'm going to go visit Steinstueken. That will show that, by the fact that I'm standing there, that will show that we mean to protect the people in that village. So he tried to drive there, and I have this story in the book where he was going to drive there early in the morning, and he was going to go at a time when there were like only 1 or 2 East German border guards on, and he knew that he was world famous. So his plan was to show up at the border post, jump out, use his general's authority, and bully the 2 East German privates into letting him go into Steinstueken. The only way that would work is if the word didn't leak out. Well, the next morning he gets there to the border checkpoint, and there is the mayor of the neighborhood, his wife, a whole bunch of West German school children, a whole bunch of West German reporters, and on the other side of the wire, about 100 East German police. So he knew that he wasn't going to be able to drive there. All right, so I'm going to skip through this. Let me see how we're doing on time here. I did want to show you this one. Okay, we're doing okay on time here. All right. So let me go back and explain briefly why the United States in 1961 still cared about Steinstueken. At this point, we were trying to bring West German troops into NATO. We'd actually brought them in the late 50s, but there was still some resistance in West Germany about that. So NATO was at the point where it needed some fresh blood, and it was not getting the level of support that from other Western European countries that the U.S. government felt it needed. So they really needed the Germans in uniform to be part of the NATO operation. And of course, the West German people had to accept that. So now we're going back to the old canary in the coal mine thing. If America loses its, if America doesn't fulfill its promises in Berlin, maybe the West Germans will decide not to align with us as closely as we wanted them to. Also, at this point, West Berlin was a huge asset for the U.S. government. A Soviet general once talked about how West Berlin was like a rotten tooth in the center of the Soviet occupation zone because you had this section of West Berlin that was prosperous, that was lit up every night, and up until the time of the Berlin Wall, if you were in East Germany, you could go visit West Berlin. So you would go visit West Berlin, see all the nice things they had, and then you would go back to your home and you would just obviously do comparisons. Anyone here speak German? Okay, can you tell me what that says? I know it's kind of hard to read.
Well, it says,
it says the Free Berlin, at the very top, it says, at the very top it says, the Free Berlin Press announces. This sign, this electronic billboard was put up by West Berlin so it could be visible in East Berlin. So what they would do is they would broadcast the news on that. And they used that as an opportunity to get information into East Berlin. So it was a huge PR problem for, West Berlin was a huge PR problem for the communists as long as West Berlin flourished. But if young West Berliners and West Berlin businesses lost faith in the community and left, there was concern that Berlin would just hollow out and become a shell and be an embarrassment. So we needed to keep the spirits of the West Berliners up. By the way, any of these slides that you have here, I'll be glad to leave you a copy. So So that was one of the things Clay was especially worried about, is that a lot of the prosperous West Berlin companies that the Americans had worked very hard to establish in West Berlin so that West Berliners could pay their own bills as opposed to getting American aid might move to West Germany. So he needed to raise their spirits. Yes?
About how much influence West German television had in the East. I had a friend in East Berlin, and what did she want from the West? Birdseed. She had seen it advertised on West German television.
Did she ever say anything about bananas?
Yeah.
Apparently bananas were something that were almost impossible to get in East Germany. And when the Berlin Wall came down and East Germans flooded into West Berlin supermarkets, apparently that's one of the big things they were looking for. They were asking for bananas, and the people in the West Berlin supermarkets like, bananas, why? Why bananas? But apparently it was just something you couldn't get in East Germany. Okay. So we talked earlier about unintended consequences. The fact that Steinstueken was an American responsibility was an unintended consequence of how they actually divided up the occupation sectors. And depending on your point of view, that one didn't work out well for the Americans because it stuck us with the burden of Steinstueken, although I'm glad it worked out because I think it gave us an opportunity to shine. But at this particular point, Clay is looking for a way to get into Steinstueken. And here's another unintended consequence of immediate post-World War II planning that this time worked out very well for the Americans. What you're looking at here is something called the Berlin Control Zone, this circle here. Anyone who has followed the Berlin airlift might recognize these three corridors here. The reason the Berlin airlift was possible is that we had made specific agreements with the Soviets for 3 air corridors that we could use to fly in from the British and the American zones. And during the Berlin blockade, the Soviets honored those agreements. And so these are these three corridors. This was coming from the British zone, these two coming in from the American zone into Berlin. And those are the corridors they used for the airlift, and then after that, they used that for commercial travel. Well, in 1945, when the Americans, British, and French and Russians first got to Berlin, and they were making plans for air traffic control, they said, you know, when an aircraft comes to Berlin, we're higher in the northern latitudes, it's foggy around here a lot, planes going to have to circle around, and so we're going to have planes coming in from 4 different occupying powers, and we don't want to tell them just to circle over their own zone. I mean, they need a place that they can circle and wait until there's a landing strip at Tempelhof for them to open up in. So they came up with something called the Berlin Control Zone. It's measured from the center of the Berlin Air Safety Center, which is in the center of Berlin, and it went out 32 kilometers or 20 miles. And any aircraft, any of the Allied powers could fly anywhere within that zone as long as they did not go over 10,000 feet. Now, this was before helicopters, so nobody really thought that anybody would use this zone very much. Well, in 1961, we had helicopters. There were helicopters in Berlin, and Steinstueken was within the Berlin Control Zone. So, one morning, Steinstuckeners are out in their gardens. They hear helicopter blades. They look, see an Army helicopter land. Out steps Lucius Clay, who everybody recognizes. But I think there was a local there who was a stringer for the Berlin press. He took these pictures, and the citizens were overjoyed. And so they ran up to him. They gave him flowers. They gave him a tour of the village. The Americans will let the kids and the families climb around the helicopter because most of the kids had never seen one before. And so Clay makes a very just general statement that, yes, we're going to protect you. But the simple fact that he was there emphasized that the United States was going to, the message he was saying is that this is the most vulnerable part of the American occupation center in Berlin, and I'm here. So we're going to protect this, then you can count on us to protect everything else that's in West Berlin. And it was one of the first times, I think it was actually the first time in the Berlin Wall crisis where the Americans actually pushed back on the Russians a bit. And it forced them to respond. The East Germans complained that we had violated their airspace. The British actually complained. They thought it was a provocative act. But that's the kind of stuff that General Clay did. But Clay realized he needed to do a little bit more. And before I go on, I'm going to show you this picture. I think this one's kind of poignant here. These are the Steinstuckeners waving goodbye. You can kind of see them off in the distance. There's another crew of people there. These are their former neighbors, people that they had known for years, that were now separated from them by the barbed wire. So they were watching the helicopter go too. So I remember when we went to Berlin in 1988, my colonel said, the reason I'm taking you up here is so you know why you're in Germany, why the U.S. Army's here. Took us to the Berlin Wall. And I think of that every time I see this picture. All right, Clay realized that let's not take chances. Let's put some American troops in Berlin, or in Steinstueken. So these are members of the 287th Military Police Company. That was Berlin Brigade's military police company. And they established a presence patrol. There were only 3 or 4 MPs in the village at any one time. The biggest weapon they had was what's called a grease gun there. It's like a machine pistol. So they were not set up for any kind of battle. But what they were is they were like a tripwire. You know, if you mess with these soldiers, you were then messing with the U.S. government. The old phrase, boots on the ground. Clay put boots on the ground, and he meant that sent that as a message to the Russians, because they knew him from the Berlin blockade days, and so they had a pretty good idea that Clay would respond if anything happened to them, and so they left him alone. All right. So the way that those MPs got in from 1961 to 1972 was by helicopter. This is the village of Steinstueken. This area that was plowed around it is something that's called the Death Strip, because if you crossed into Steinstueken over the Death Strip, you were probably going to get shot at. You were going to get shot at. There's no records that I found of anyone trying to get into Steinstueken who was actually killed. There were some people nearby who got killed by East German border guards, but they did, when the Berlin Wall first went up, before this death strip had been created, there wasn't this cleared area, they did have a lot of East Germans that were actually breaking into Steinstueken, and we talk about those in the book. One particularly dramatic example where some East Germans in a school bus rammed through the wire fence, and the front part of the bus was in Steinstueken, the back part of the bus was in East Germany, and so the GDR border guards are coming around the back part of the bus, and fortunately an American MP shows up at the front part of the bus, and he pulls out the machine pistol and lets a whole clip off over them and gets them out. And so they had that, and that happened relatively frequently in the first few years, and what the MPs would do is they would dress the refugees in U.S. Army uniforms. Clip their hair, put on ponchos, because when the helicopters came in, the GDR could see who they were, and they didn't want the GDR to be able to look out and see who was getting on the helicopter, because like if I identify you as being Franz Mueller, and I know that you live in East Berlin, and I know where your parents are, okay, now I'm going to retaliate against your family, I'm going to throw your sister out of college because I saw you get on the helicopter. And so we dressed them up as U.S. soldiers to get them out of there. All right. Lots of dignitaries would come to visit Steinstueken in the 60s and the 70s because it was a unique place to come. That's Willy Brandt, who was the mayor of West Berlin. And whenever American dignitaries came, it was a big event for the entire village. And so this is the common sight. You'd see generals talking to each other, and kids are walking around with them and standing next to them while they're looking at the border at the border sites. All right, so these are some sites from Steinstueken after the MPs arrived. This is the dirt road that connected Steinstueken to West Berlin. This MP was watching East German border personnel who were working on the border fence that day. That gentleman there is a photographer from the GDR, and they were constantly taking pictures of the American soldiers. And for those of you that know how U.S. Army uniforms are set up, this is where your name tape is. Well, notice how this soldier has it covered over, because they didn't want them to be able to identify the Americans who were in there, because they were keeping track of that. One American pilot, after the Berlin Wall came down, he went to Steinstueken, and he went to a building that they know had been used by the GDR border guards, and he went in there and he opened up the book, and there was a record for every day during the time that he had been flying. And they listed every tail number of every American helicopter that came in, so he could see days that he had seen him fly into Steinstueken. So they watched them very closely. Very close relationship between the U.S. Between Berlin Brigade and the people in Steinstueken. Berlin Brigade built a helicopter playset, which is still there. And so in this particular case, you see a local official is throwing candy, and kids do what kids do when candy is thrown to them. The MPs had a tradition of bringing the children of Steinstueken to the American mess hall for Thanksgiving. And those of you that have been in the American military know that Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, especially when you're stationed overseas, are big deals. Everyone gets dressed up. It's a huge feast. And so what they would do is every Thanksgiving, you would have all the children of Steinstueken with some chaperones walk up that wooden path, get on Army buses, and go to the American Concern. And these are pictures from the American military newspaper of kids enjoying Thanksgiving. We also flew Thanksgiving dinner in for many years, and the Steinstuekens especially loved that. They said they'd never this one girl said, "I'd never tasted sweet potatoes before," and the Americans brought them in. So, as you can see here, the North Pole was not part of the occupying power, so Santa could not bring his sled in. So instead, Berlin Brigade had to fly him in. I put this in here because in the later years, right before the wall came down, the Berlin Brigade Aviation Detachment developed a really a strong relationship with the Steinstueken people, many of whom still live there. And these are pictures of Americans at the Steinstueken Fest. That's the commander of the Berlin Brigade Aviation Detachment at the time, Major Doug Powell. And this is the guidon, which is the symbol of the unit. And this streamer that you see there, that was knitted for him by the ladies in Steinstueken. The people in Steinstueken came up to the detachment and said, "We'd like to do something for you. What could we do?" And he said, "Could you give us a streamer for our guidon?" Then he had explained to them what a guidon was. They didn't understand that. And so then they knitted that, and that's still in the Allied Museum of Berlin today. And these are locals. The Army flew a helicopter in for the village's annual Summerfest. Any of you who've been to Germany know that Summerfests are a big deal because it's cloudy most of the year there. So when the sun comes out, it's a really big deal for the Germans. They all have fests, and Steinstueken had one, and the Americans were a big part of that. Okay, and these two memorials are still in Steinstueken today. This was created by the local government. These are Huey main rotor blades off the Huey helicopter. The gentleman right here was a former Berlin Brigade pilot. Obviously, based on the long beard, you can see he's long retired from the Army. And in the background, you see that helicopter playset. And the people in Steinstueken maintain that to this day. They refurbish it, and their grandkids play on it, and they tell them the stories of when the Americans came and kept the village safe. These are some pictures inside their clubhouse. So, I mean, at least in West Berlin, there is one clubhouse where there's a huge American flag and all sorts of mementos remembering the Americans' time in Steinstueken. All right, I'm going to give these slides to y'all. These are some of the references that, if you want to read more on the subject, these are the references I would recommend. A lot of these references are free of charge because they're U.S. government records. They're in the public domain. One of the nice things about the occupation, American occupation in Europe, was that there was a lot of pushback in the United States against the occupation, because it was very expensive. And so the people that were the occupation authorities were producing lots of magazines and studies explaining what they were doing and why they were doing it. And that's all online right now. The American Military Community newspaper for Berlin is still available, the Berlin Observer Online. Go to theberlinobserver.com. That's its logo right there. It's got a lot of information for that. If there's an organization that you're interested, if you're looking for an organization that supports continuing continuing the close ties between the Americans and the Berliners from the Cold War, the one that I would recommend is something called the Checkpoint Charlie Foundation. And Checkpoint Charlie, again, was the checkpoint that you went through going from West Berlin into East Berlin. And they do a lot of work, especially with teachers, especially with students, trying to keep the American-Berlin ties really strong. That's my contact information. Again, I'll make that available to you. And I want to close off by doing a favor for a gentleman who's helped out the overall Cold War history community. I'm sure everybody remembers the name Gary Powers. Okay, his son, Gary Powers Jr., is a prominent Cold War historian. And if you know of anybody that is interested in doing a Cold War tour being led by somebody who actually has ties to a bona fide Cold War hero, he is going during this time in March. So the Cold War Museum in outside of D.C., mention him to me. He's a good guy, trying to help people remember some things that we'd like folks to remember. So if you know of anybody that's interested in a Cold War tour, again, I'll leave the slide with you, and you can reach out to those folks directly. So Gary's been good to us. So I wanted to go ahead and put a plug in for his presentation. And those are all the slides that I had. And we're right at 40 minutes. So I'd like to open up the floor to questions.